This is a great article by Michael Tracey at his Substack, and it says the UK is trying to drag the US into World War III. And let me just read a little bit for me. I'm going to bring in Michael and talk about it. There's a chap called Tobias Ellwood who spent the past week doggedly promoting his latest idea to save Western civilization. Quote, from a military perspective, Ellwood explained during a recent speaking engagement, it's never been more urgent to impose a humanitarian sea corridor. That's CSEA. A humanitarian sea corridor off the coast of Ukraine. This would involve an outright naval intervention by NATO in the Black Sea, with the objective being to prevent Russia from seizing control of the strategically important city of Odessa. Perhaps upon commencement of this mission, Ellwood suggested, listless denizens of the West will finally come to appreciate the existential stakes of the conflict now before us and accept that we are actually in a 1938 period, but actually worse. The double actually was presumably included for maximum emphasis. Notably, Ellwood is not some random crank. He is actually a member of Parliament in the United Kingdom and the chairman of the impressively titled Defense Select Committee. In the latter capacity, he seeks to exert influence over the defense policy of Her Majesty's government, which is currently led by his Conservative Party colleague, Boris Johnson. And this is the guy we're talking about, Tobias Ellwood, member of Parliament. He says, during the private event hosted by a think tank, which unilaterally and hilariously decreed his comments off the record, Ellwood described the plan he envisaged for how his new phase of military intervention in Ukraine would unfold. It should be up to the UK to create a coalition of the willing. Remember when you heard that last time? Yeah, that was the terminology once used for countries that participated in the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which memorably included the UK. Ellwood evidently detected no ignominy. How do you say that, Michael? Ignominy at all in his historical association.
It's like bad.
Yeah,
it means badness.
I inferred. I've always heard it ignominiously. I've never heard
ignominiously. Ignominy is like the noun.
You know? Yeah, I never heard the root word. On the subject of Ukraine, Ellwood's view is that the UK and Europe must stop waiting around for the US to get its act together and instead proactively initiate the kind of muscular, unapologetic military action that is currently needed against Russia. The lesson of last year's Afghanistan withdrawal, Ellwood charged, as well as Joe Biden's purported Ukraine-related dithering, the lesson of that has been to expose America to be very, very hesitant indeed. He explained, I see the United States almost catching up with where, from a military perspective, a vanguard may actually go. So, Michael, you wrote this, and there's a lot more to it. I encourage everybody to go check it out. It's a great article. But I've noticed that Ukraine, isn't the UK, aren't they also now bragging that they have boots on the ground in Ukraine? Go fill me in. Where did this take place and what's going on?
Yeah, well, I'm actually in London right now.
Oh, okay.
So I've been trying to report on the UK role in intensifying this military intervention. And it really is a military intervention. I was in Poland for a couple weeks in March, and you can go and visibly see the U.S. military presence, particularly in the southeastern part of the country, where these weapons shipments are being facilitated from Poland into Ukraine. So when NATO sends these latest batches of weaponry, or the U.S. into Ukraine, it's largely being facilitated by this new military outpost that the U.S. has erected a couple of miles from the Ukraine border in Poland. And the UK is basically in a position where it is now arguably even more vehement in demanding an intensification of the conflict than the U.S. And you see this person, Tobias Ellwood, a member of Parliament, kind of at the cutting edge of that, because he was going around to these think tank events where I got access to one. And then, they, as I mentioned in the article, they hilariously declared off the record without even like consulting anyone who was there, as though I signed a written agreement saying, oh, yes, okay, sure, British think tank, this is all solemnly off the record. Yeah, all right. And one of the reasons why I guess it was off the record is because he was unusually candid in his criticisms of the U.S. And his criticism of the U.S. was that basically Biden has not been assertive enough in taking the lead in seeing to it that this war will escalate. So they were basically brainstorming ways to goad or cajole the U.S. into a more intensified military commitment in Ukraine. And it's ironic, right? Because the U.S. already has a massive military commitment in Ukraine. It's the leading facilitator of the proxy war at this point. Biden, every couple of days, it seems, announces a new batch of weaponry that's even a higher and higher grade. So it's not like the U.S. is just dragging its feet and sitting it out, right? But it's not enough for a lot of actors within Europe, in particular Poland and the U.K. They're at the vanguard, as Tobias put it, of trying to instigate even greater confrontation. So Tobias Ellwood has this zany idea of trying to organize some UK-led military intervention, naval intervention in the Black Sea to prevent Russia from seizing Odessa, because they've already written off Mariupol, which is about to fall any day, it seems, officially. And the idea is that to Russia, Russia's about to seize Mariupol, which is the last kind of bastion of this Azov regiment. And Tobias Ellwood and people who share the similar thinking are saying, we under no circumstances can allow them to also seize Odessa, the other crucial Black Sea port city. Right, so that's why they're contemplating this naval intervention. If it sounds crazy, right? I mean, it sounds like it would be an obvious initiation of World War III, right?
Yes.
I mean, it would do exactly what Joe Biden is saying cannot be done, because it would constitute World War III. That's what Tobias Ellwood is trying to use his position within the Conservative Party in the UK to initiate. And so you might, if you're just looking at this from afar, think to yourself, well, I mean, this guy's just one MP. And he's just a conservative, so maybe it's just limited to a irrelevant faction within the Conservative Party. Right? Wrong. A couple days after Tobias Ellwood started debuting this proposal, I was flipping through the Sunday edition of the Observer newspaper. I mean, the Observer newspaper is basically the paradigmatic example of respectable liberal opinion in the UK, right? It's the Guardian, the Sunday paper. And they editorialized in support of a naval intervention in the Black Sea to confront Russia and prevent them from seizing Odessa. So they took what might have been considered a fringe proposal, just emanating from this one MP, and gave it the veneer of establishment liberal respectability in the pages of the Observer, which is like the most well-regarded newspaper for this element within British society. But then it goes beyond that, right? Because that same weekend, and I document this in the article as well, I went to a pro-war march that was organized by left-wing activists.
Wow.
Okay, in Whitehall, basically in the governmental corridor of central London, around the Houses of Parliament, Downing Street, etc. It was run by some of the biggest labor unions, like this union called Unison, which is both private and public employees, in concert with members of the left-wing media. There's this journalist named Paul Mason, who was formerly a journalist at the BBC for, I think, 13 years, and he worked at Channel 4. Now he's sort of freelance. And in that capacity, he's organizing these pro-war rallies with labor unions to mobilize the labor movement, which is connected to the Labour Party in the UK, to support war in Ukraine. And you had them marching around. You had these labor union people and left-wing activists marching around chanting, "Arm, arm, arm, Ukraine. Put an end to Putin's reign." So they're calling for regime change at a left-wing rally that they were insisting to me was an anti-war rally, even though that the objective was to send more and more arms, weaponry to Ukraine by way of the UK government, the US government, and NATO. So they're enlisting the UK government, the US government, and NATO in their supposedly anti-war left-wing activist cause. And so what you really have is this really striking and intractable ideological convergence where everybody from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party to the left-wing activists to some of the more even the kind of right-wing pundits, they're all in total unflinching agreement about one thing, which is to escalate the war even further. And Boris Johnson was the first world leader to go to Kiev and have this PR jaunt. And then Joe Biden followed in that lead a few days later. So, yeah, I mean, it is the case that even if Tobias Ellwood's particular plan for a naval intervention isn't being implemented quite yet, the UK is leading the US in this march toward an ever intensified, escalated intervention, because Biden does an escalation pretty much every day. Last week, on one day, he all of a sudden was declaring that Putin was committing genocide. And by the way, Trump then said the same thing a couple of days later. So there's total ideological convergence also in the US, more or less, on this issue. And then the following day, Biden says, oh, you know what? I had originally said we're not going to send these attack helicopters to Ukraine. But after my moving phone call with Zelensky, it turns out we are going to send the attack helicopters. So that was in the latest batch of weaponry sent by the US to Ukraine. And I think people really should be cognizant of how, again, deeply embedded this new consensus is for more and more escalation in the war. Because you have people on the right, center, and left all having their own reasons, their own justifications for being incredibly fervent in their support for this pro-war posture. And I think it's more and more critical to probe the nature of that consensus for if you're a journalist. The problem is that journalists are also just as fervent, by and large, in their support for the war. So they're useless. I mean, and they're actually some of the biggest cheerleaders for escalation. It's amazing. And every time, this is also the case on U.S. TV and U.S. corporate media, but I happen to be in the UK, so I've been watching that media more. And whenever like a politician goes on Sky News or the BBC or Channel 4 even, or ITV or any of these channels, the question put to them is, why aren't we doing more in this war effort? It's never a question about the premises undergirding this military intervention. It's always like, why don't we ratchet it up a few degrees, right? And so that's how they're thinking of themselves as holding power to account, right? By saying, why aren't you exerting more military power? The propaganda is also intensifying. People. I posted a couple of photos yesterday because I was in a train station at London Bridge.
Oh yeah, station. I saw this. Yeah,
and I'm just kind of walking around because I was going somewhere, and I see all the digital ad billboards in the station are lit up in blue and yellow because the Ukrainian government was putting out this ad campaign called "Be Brave," "Be Brave Like Ukraine," and it was covering the entire station. I mean, I know the word Orwellian can be a little cliched and overused, but if you're in the train station and every angle you look in is covered in the same pro-war propaganda from a foreign government, and hardly anybody seems to mind. I mean, the term Orwellian does occur to you, and apparently today they just bought those same ads for use in Times Square. So Times Square was lit up in the same ad today. And these are foreign countries that the Ukraine government is undergoing a lobbying blitz to demand even more high-grade weaponry be sent to them, and that's to say nothing of the no-fly zone, which keeps getting floated, even though it's allegedly been dismissed as an impossibility. Well, I don't know how impossible it is. Chris Coons, the #1 basically advisor or emissary to Joe Biden in the Senate, because he holds the seat that Biden once held in Delaware, out of nowhere last week started saying, look, we all need to get serious and think about when the U.S. is not just going to send arms to Ukraine, but troops. That's Chris Coons on a PR blitz, basically trying to condition the public to accept the inevitability of a U.S. troop deployment to Ukraine and trying to exert pressure on Biden, who he's an extremely close ally of, not even really an ally, like a confidant or an emissary, but basically the number one conduit to Biden in the Senate. He's trying to habituate or condition the public to accept as an inevitability that there eventually will be a U.S. troop deployment to Ukraine. So you take that into consideration along with what's going on in the UK, along with what's going on in Poland and other places, and we have a recipe for just a incessant progression towards some kind of wider escalation, because the U.S. is not doing anything to de-escalate. Every step that the U.S. takes on the diplomatic front, on the military front, on the rhetorical front, just in terms of Biden, calling Putin a war criminal or accusing him of genocide, et cetera, it's all trending toward escalation. And there's nothing counteracting it, because the left-wing activists are all gung-ho in favor of escalation. So is much of the right. So is the center-left, the center-right, the corporate media. Everybody's unified behind this. And, I think it's more vital than ever for the handful of people who have a somewhat opposing view or skeptical view to be more vigorous in presenting that view. Otherwise, we're just going to be all snowballed down this path to an incredibly cataclysmic outcome if everything continues in the direction that it seems to be heading in.
Michael Tracey has been our guest. He's the writer of that article, and you can find it at his Substack, mtracy.substack.com. Michael, thank you very much. Let me, before I let you go, how is this? I mean, we all know how this has to end. Ukraine has to remain neutral, and that's that. And NATO has to stop advancing. So how many people you think are going to have to die in Ukraine before we get to the outcome everyone knows is going to be the outcome anyway?
Well, it's a good question. I think from a U.S. perspective, it's been made abundantly clear that the U.S. perceives within its interest to prolong the war for as long as possible. So you'll notice that when these additional tranches of weapons are announced, they're big, but they're not that big that they would make a hugely decisive difference, right? I mean, it's like $800 million, which is a lot of money, obviously, but in the grand scope of the U.S. budget, it's not that much. So they're just doing just enough to prolong it, right? And to make it so that, the weapons manufacturers will have enough of a client base to keep this going for the foreseeable future. Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, within the past week or two, when he was testifying before Congress, seemingly was the first to say, look, this could go on for years. And that's not just him
popping off,
hypothesizing.
Yeah.
The U.S. has a direct role in determining how long it's going to last, right? It's not like there's some passive observer, right? So, on the day that Biden announced this latest tranche of weapons, which was small, but again, big enough that it actually could have some difference around the margins, right? If they're giving attack helicopters, and if they're saying we're now going to forget about any remaining distinction between offensive and defensive weaponry, so we're going to provide new kinds of intelligence to the Ukrainian military so they can conduct offensive operations in the Donbass, where the war is just expanded to as of today, and Russia launched its latest offensive. On that day, the Pentagon convened this meeting with 8 of the largest U.S. weapons contractors in a classified setting to prepare for what was reported by Reuters to be a protracted conflict. Now, they're again, what the purpose of this, at least in part, seems to be to habituate the public to accept as an inevitability the logic of a protracted conflict, as if the U.S., again, is just a passive observer that has no direct role in creating that outcome. So I don't know how many people are going to have to die, but I know what U.S. policy is all geared toward. They undercut the so-called peace negotiations, which were probably a facade from the outset, because Zelensky, he later revealed, was never willing to give up any territorial concessions at all.
Right.
Which, if you do want to stop the war, that would at least probably have to be on the table. But the U.S. threw cold water on that, and the U.S. is the decisive player essentially in these negotiations, because Russia and Putin have been clear. It's not about just dealing with Ukraine as such. Ukraine matters to them, at least in large part, as a proxy of the U.S. Putin, when he launched the war, said one of the reasons he was doing so was that Ukraine had been turned into a military colony of the U.S. So the U.S. must be party to any of these negotiations, and every step of the way, the U.S. and the Biden administration undercut the negotiations.
That's right.
And why? Well, I mean, the easily discernible reason is because they wanted to continue, and Biden called himself for regime change in Russia. So maybe we ought to just take them at their word. And they want this to go on perpetually.
I think who knows, but maybe this is why the military-industrial complex, which is really people who really run our foreign policy, maybe this is why they allowed Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan, because they knew they were going to get him to go into Ukraine and just keep another war going. And let's remember, the Afghanistan war, as Julian Assange pointed out, was not there so we could win it. It was there to transfer funds to the international security state. Michael, we got to run. Thank you again. Tracy.substack.com. Thank you so much, Michael. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Jimmy.
We're doing live stand-up shows in Cleveland, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Des Moines, Omaha, Kansas City, Las Vegas, all over the country. Go to jimmydorcomedy.com for a link for tickets, and single tickets now available at all venues. So if you tried to buy one before and you couldn't, single tickets are now available. Plus, while you're at jimmydorcomedy.com, why don't you become a premium member? Sign up to our mailing list so when they cancel us, we can still stay in touch.